The new iPhone 15 is out, so let's talk about Dynamic Island and the new USB Type-C. Hey, what up? It's your boy MobbJustice back again with another video, doing things differently. Today we are in Thailand, and I just thought I would react to the recently announced iPhone 15 and 15 Pro lines. As always, this video is brought to you by the team over at Lion Media. Head on over to check out some of the crispiest photo, video, and audio content. That's www.lionmedia.com. Head on over, check it out, and just see what the team can do for you. Well, you know, once again, as they do in September, announcing a set of devices, new Apple Watches as well as new iPhones. But for today, we're going to be focusing on the new iPhone 15 range. Now, there are a couple of themes that I wanted to focus on that stuck out to me. And the three, main ones is firstly, Dynamic Island. Now, Dynamic Island basically replaced the notch on the iPhone 14 line, the Pro line. So anyone who's got an iPhone 14 Pro and Pro Max knows the Dynamic Island, and it was Apple's solution to getting rid of the notch, but they haven't completely done an edge-to-edge display yet. But now, you now have Dynamic Island across the entire iPhone line, and it does seem as if this will now be the signature that Apple is using to distinguish its phones above everyone else. We've always seen Apple doing this. People will remember that the first iPhone up to the iPhone 8, the distinguishing factor was always that home button. The iPhone was distinct in having that home button. Then from the iPhone 10 onwards, they used the notch as a way, as a design cue that would immediately let people know that that is an iPhone. And now it seems that they're taking a bet on Dynamic Island as the next evolution, of that. And looking back at that history, the other thing to note is the fact that when the iPhone 10 came out a few years ago, it came out at the same time as the iPhone 8 line. And when they did that, you now had two iPhones that had the traditional design with the home button, and then the iPhone 10 was the one that now had the notch. And then a year later, they then with the 10s range decided that the notch was the way that they were going to take their phone forwards. And outside of maybe the iPhone SE and the like, the notch was now this distinguishing factor. And we saw them using the same strategy again last year, because last year the Dynamic Island only came out on the Pro lines, and now they've decided that this is the way to go, and it's now appearing on all devices. Now, the second thing is the fact that iPhone finally has USB Type-C. A lot of people have been hoping for this, and finally you can throw away your lightning cables and just carry that one cable that will allow you to go between Android and iOS devices. But if you're in the Apple ecosystem, you can now use just USB-C, because Macs use USB-C and iPads USB-C. So driven by some legislation over in the EU, and we're glad that this is finally happening. Now, a little bit of history around the Lightning port. This actually came out for the first time back in 2012 with the iPhone 5. And at the time, Phil Schiller, the Apple executive, said that this was going to be Apple's future for the next decade.
This connector is a modern connector for the next decade.
And that has actually materialized, because this is now 11 years later that they have had to make this particular change. They did not really want to make this change because, some will know or may not know that Apple actually makes quite a bit of money from the licensing of the Lightning standard. If you are a proper company that makes accessories that use Lightning, you have to pay a licensing fee to Apple, because it's a proprietary standard. So Apple has been making money from this standard for over a decade. So them switching over to something that's more open source, such such as USB-C means they have to let go of that control. Obviously, it's a transition period, which means that it's gonna take time to completely get rid of, all lightning cables around the world, right? So they will continue to make money from that point of view. But when it comes to their new devices, it seems they no longer have that particular edge. So even after making this particular change, Apple obviously has to be Apple and make it seem as if they came up with some of these ideas themselves. And there are a couple of features that are being touted around USB Type-C. The first one being faster transfer speeds, because if you think about it, Lightning is an old port and it hadn't, been able to keep up with the speed and developments around USB Type-C, particularly the USB 3 standard. So, big one on that side. And then obviously they then come in and say that you can now charge your Apple Watch as well as some other devices like AirPods using that USB type slot. So you do have that control on that end. It is interesting simply because if you look on the side of Samsung, well, they started doing power sharing a long time ago, and that has been wireless, right? So, at least we're seeing something coming through from Apple. And it's always nice, the fact that finally we now have the iPhone being in line with everything else that's going on in the world of Apple, the Mac, the MacBook, as well as the iPad, all of which are carrying USB Type-C ports and cables. Look at the Apple TV remote and the Apple TV itself. You're seeing all of those, different things happening. The other piece of the equation for me is audio. Apple released a new set of earpods that will now feature USB Type-C port. Traditionally, if you had some of the older styles, you had to use the dongle. I actually have one, but for me, this actually sticks out because the headphone jack is still gone, but at least it means that realistically you could carry one wired set of earbuds or earphones as long as it has a USB Type-C port, and you should be able to listen to your audio. So who knows, maybe USB Type-C could become, one of those wired standards that people could use, because there's still a lot of professional work that needs to be done via wired. And it's, sometimes it's nice to have wired. It's still one of the best ways for you to listen to audio, right? So you do have that to consider. And then one of the things that is quite apparent, and we've been seeing it over the year, starting with the removal of the headphone jack, is the fact that Apple is quite focused on getting rid of ports on its iPhones. You can see all the things that they've been doing, moving away from the headphone jack to wireless, and right now they're trying to train the consumer into charging wirelessly using MagSafe. So you can almost see that they're preparing for a day when there are no ports to talk about on the iPhone. The last thing that stands out to me is that we are seeing a solidification of the strategy with Apple using older chips for its base models. We saw this first on the iPhone 14 range, where the 14 and 14 Plus got the same chips as the 13 Pro and Pro Max. So this year, your 15 and 15 Plus gets the same chips as the 14 and 14 Plus. That is the A16 Bionic, which is a beast of a chip, showing that Apple really does rate, its chips out there. They've done a lot to develop their own silicon over the years, and we have spoken, quite a bit about what they've been able to do on the Mac with the M1 and the M2, as well as processing on the iPad, as well as Apple TV and the whole host of their products across the board. But the other piece is the fact that this strategy also solidifies a distinction or separation between the base models as well as the Pro range, because back in the day there was little separating these things, but now there's more and more. Traditionally it was a camera and that type of thing, but now we are definitely seeing that there's more that's coming. It's the camera, it's the chips, even the USB-C port that is being offered on the 15 Pro is more powerful than the one that is on the base 15. So we are seeing more and more of that strategy to say that if you want the latest and greatest, Apple is trying to encourage its customers to go out and get the 15 Pro range. But even with all that, it hasn't been smooth sailing for Apple because I think it was last week they actually renewed a deal with Qualcomm, which is famous for making many of the cellular networking chips in many of our devices. And Apple has tried to move away from Qualcomm but hasn't been able to crack the formula on that particular front, showing the value that Qualcomm still brings and offers to the market. But we're definitely going to see Apple try and crack that so that they can control even more and more of that particular supply chain. Last thing to note, I think my focus was mainly on, as I said, it was Dynamic Island, it was the USB-C port, as well as the chips. But a note on the camera is simply to say a lot of camera tests are going to come out, so we're going to have so much content that will be happening around the camera. But for me, it's just to note that, for the first time, in, I'm going to say close to a decade-ish or so, Apple has decided to do away with the 12 megapixel main camera that had been, front and center on its devices, for many years. And now even the base iPhone 15 has a 48 megapixel camera, which is now going to be carrying the Apple line forward. Great upgrade, and we're going to be looking forward to see what type of content people will be able to create. So that's where we end off for today's video. You guys can let us know what you think of these upgrades. On my side, I would say that these were more incremental updates. I would say the introduction of Dynamic Island last year was probably a bit more, groundbreaking. Of course, USB Type-C is a huge move, for Apple, and it's going to have many impacts. But if you still have one of the older iPhones, particularly in the 13 range or the 14 range, I think you're still more or less fine. But that does present an opportunity, for people who are in the market for new phones, because devices in that particular range, particularly the 14s, are now going to be dropping in price. The Pro Max sneakily got a $200 price bump. Of course, there's more storage, but there is a price bump on that end. But if you're looking for something cheaper, there's an opportunity to get in with an older device. You guys can let us know what you think. Did I miss anything? Are there any parts that you want explored? You guys can let us know what you think, and I'll catch you in the next video.
This is Muffs Too Much, and you're watching MobbJustice TV. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, follow us on Twitter. We're there on YouTube. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe.